a bonfire on a summer night, the crack of wooden wheels, and the rattle of chains. That's not a caravan, it's a wall on wheels. In the early 1400s, farmers, smiths, and students in Bohemia, roughly today's Czech Republic, pushed back 5 church-backed crusades with a field fortress made of farm wagons and grit. Their cause began with a preacher, Jan Hus, who called for reform and equal communion for laypeople. He went to the Council of Constance with a promise of safe conduct and died at the stake in 1415. The council condemned him and ordered the execution. Outrage spread. A year later, Prague exploded. Officials were hurled from a town hall window. The first defenestration of Prague in 1419, and the county chose open resistance. What followed is one of the most surprising chapters in medieval history. Ordinary fighters, guided by a one-eyed commander named Jan Žižka, beat professional armies from across Central Europe and forced a political settlement on their own terms. Why Bohemia revolted? Start with the message, not the weapons. Jan Hus preached in Prague against church abuses and for a simpler, more accountable faith. He also argued that laypeople should receive communion in both bread and wine, the chalice as a public symbol. That teaching, called utraquism, from the Latin under both kinds, became the rallying point after his death in 1415. Hus was arrested at the Council of Constance, despite a safe conduct letter, tried and buried as a heretic on July 6, 1450. His ashes were dumped into the Rhine to prevent veneration. The shock was double: a popular scholar killed and a promise broken. In 1419, Prague streets boiled over. A Hussite crowd demanding prisoner releases stormed the new town hall. Several city officials were thrown from the windows, the first defenestration of Prague. It was a political act with a brutal message. The city would no longer obey distant rulers or church courts. That event directly triggered the First Crusade against Bohemia, and the Hussite Wars began. What did the rebels want, exactly? A short document called the 4 Articles of Prague outlined their core goals: the free preaching of the gospel, communion in both kinds for laity and clergy, the end of the church's world domination and excessive wealth, and the punishment of serious public sins without regard to status. Those articles became the movement's test of fairness in any negotiation. Who were the Hussites? Not a single army or party, but a coalition. Moderates, known as utraquists or Calixtines, centered in Prague, sought reform within the church. Radicals gathered at a new town, Tabor, and took the name Taborites. Both drew support from guilds, towns, and countryside parishes. Leadership on the battlefield fell to Jan Žižka, an experienced soldier who had lost one eye years earlier. He welded militia bands into disciplined infantry, taught them to move together, and made a weapon out of whatever Bohemia could make in quantity: sturdy farm wagons, chains, hooks, polearms, crossbows, and early gunpowder pieces, hand cannons, and small bombards. The church and the emperor answered with formal crusades. Between 1420 and 1431, 5 crusades were launched against Bohemia. Each time, the Hussite field forces blocked the invasion or shattered it, then raided border regions to force talks on their terms. This rhythm, invade, fail, negotiate, defined the wars for more than a decade. One number gives the scale of the early crisis. In 1420, at Witkov Hill outside Prague, Žižka held a key ridge against a Crusader cavalry force estimated at around 7,000 to 8,000 horses. The forward redoubt he commanded began with roughly 80 soldiers, reinforced by about 50 archers from the city, a tiny force compared to the attackers. The Crusaders lost hundreds, and the siege of Prague collapsed. People remembered the symbol: a small, prepared position and a militia that refused to break. That mix, moral goals framed by the 4 Articles, outrage after Huss's death, and a practical plan to defend home ground, explains why artisans and peasants defied a pope and lived to push for a treaty. This was not a revolt of chaos. It was a revolt with a program: a flag, the chalice, and a system that taught ordinary people how to stand in line and win. The wagon fortresses and the new way of fighting. The famous Hussite tool was the Wagenburg, the wagon fortress. Picture linked carts drawn into a rough square or crescent, chained wheel to wheel. The gaps became firing slits. Behind them stood crossbowmen and gunners. Between them, pikemen and axemen waited. When cavalry hit the wall, horses balked at the wood and iron. Crossbows and small guns punched holes at short range. Then the infantry struck with flails and blades. If the enemy fell back, the line unhooked and rolled forward to another position. A farm train became a moving fortification, a simple idea with enormous bite. The shift was not just hardware, it was timing. Ziska drilled people to act together. He used ground, water, and towns as part of the plan. At Zoetermeer in 1420, he anchored his wagons between ponds so heavy cavalry had to funnel into mud and narrow ground. The attack failed. At Witkopf Hill that same year, he fortified a narrow ridge, cut off approaches, and used a small garrison to hold out until city reinforcements arrived. The Crusader line collapsed into the river below, and the siege ended. Gunpowder's role is often exaggerated or minimized. The truth sits in the middle. Hussite infantry still fought with pole arms and blades for the decision. But small guns fired from behind wagons performed reliably. Break a charge, shatter the enemy's nerve, make the second and third ranks stumble. Contemporary accounts and modern summaries agree that field firearms, hand cannons, and small bombards were used systematically in these mobile forts, marking a significant step in European warfare. How big could a wagon park be? Numbers vary by source and battle, but one synthesis notes that combat lines were organized by dozens of wagons, hundreds in some deployments, enough to shape a perimeter for a medium-sized field force. At Aussig in 1426, chroniclers and modern writers describe approximately 11,000 Hussite troops, accompanied by about 500 war wagons, defeating a larger imperial army on hilly terrain. Again, a mix of position, fire, and a sudden counterstroke. Ziska also adapted when offense was needed. At Kutna-Hora in 1421, facing encirclement, he used wagons in motion to punch through a stronger camp. Less a standstill fort, more a rolling shield for a breakout and counterattack. It wasn't pretty. It worked. The lesson for his enemies was clear. If you let the Hussites choose ground and cadence, numbers alone would not save you. These methods rewarded discipline more than pedigree. The soldiers were townsmen, miners, carters, students, people used to tools and order. They practiced loading, bracing, and unhooking. They learned to move when the drum beat a pattern. And because the wagons carried spare shafts, chains, stones, and powder, every short move reset the defense. In a Europe used to noble cavalry deciding battles in minutes, that reset slowed fights to the infantry's pace and gave nerves time to settle. Was it all new? Wagon lagers existed earlier for defense during marches. What the Hussites did, standardize wagons, pair them with handguns in set formations, and teach ordinary soldiers to use them as a field system, was new in scale and in doctrine. That's why later armies copied parts of it. The point wasn't to make cavalry obsolete. It was to make a charge uncertain unless the guns and the ground were on its side. Faith, politics, and the split in the movement. The Hussite wars were never only peasants versus the Pope. There were also Hussites versus Hussites over how far reform should go and how a reformed society should work. Moderates, the Utoquists and Calixtines, focused on communion in both kinds and preaching reforms while keeping many church structures. Radicals, the Taborites and their close allies, nicknamed the Orphans, pushed harder on property and clergy and built tight military communities. For a decade, foreign pressure kept them mostly aligned. When Crusaders appeared, the factions set aside their differences and fought together. In quiet seasons, they argued over law, taxes, and the strictness of enforcing religious rules. Diplomacy ran throughout the war. At the Council of Basel, church leaders met mainly with the moderate Hussites, Utoquists. They argued over the same core issue again and again, the 4 Articles, especially the Chalice. Church authorities refused to accept all 4 Articles as written. The Utoquists refused to give up communion in both bread and wine. The practical question became simple. Could Bohemia keep communion in both kinds and still remain inside the church? Over time, the church's position shifted from no to yes with conditions. In 1433, the council formally recognized Utoquists as genuine Christians. That was a major step toward a settlement, even though the radical wing dismissed it as only a partial victory. Meanwhile, the movement changed generals. Jan Žižka died in 1424. Prokop the Great and other captains kept the field forces sharp and raided across borders to pressure enemies. Those raids built negotiations, but they also built enemies and hardened lines at home. The longer the wars dragged on, the more cities and nobles wanted order, trade, and a deal, especially once it looked like they could keep the chalice with the treaty. The split became military in 1434. Near Lipany, about 25 miles east of Prague, a coalition of moderates and Catholic lords faced the radical Taborites and Orphans. Strength estimates vary, but a commonly cited figure gives roughly 14,300 on the moderate Catholic side versus about 10,700 radicals. The outcome was brutal. Around 1,300 radicals killed in action and about 700 executed after defeat, compared to roughly 200 dead among the victors. Why does that turn matter? First, it shows the Hussite story wasn't a one-note myth of heroic underdogs. It was a real society with parties, hard choices, and consequences. Second, it made room for a political finish. 2 years later, the Compact of Yalava, Iglau, recognized communion in both kinds in Bohemia and brought the moderates back into church and imperial frameworks. On Bohemia's terms more than Rome's or the emperor's. The cause that began with Huss's sermons ended with a legal carve-out for a nation's practice of faith. People stayed in the field for a decade because the goals were clear. The methods were effective, and the offers on the table continued to improve. When a treaty could deliver the chalice and peace, many took it. The lesson is less about destiny and more about leverage. Tactics bought time, which in turn rewrote the negotiation. Dispelling a few myths. Myth number 1. The Hussites won because they had guns. In reality, they won because they organized ordinary people to utilize terrain, wagons, and short-range fire in a disciplined manner. Firearms played a crucial role at key moments, but they did not replace pikes, flails, and axes. Even sympathetic accounts stress that most killing happened up close, after a charge faltered at the wagon wall. Myth number 2. The Pope sent one unstoppable crusade. Nope. 5 separate crusades were formed between 1420 and 1431. Each ended without its political goal because invading armies could not force a decision inside Bohemia. Every failure strengthened the Hussite hand at the next round of talks. Myth number 3. A tiny mob saved Prague by luck. Mainstream thought is that the numbers at Vitkov Hill are striking, but they sit inside a larger picture of prepared ground and city support. Contemporary derived figures put the forward redoubt at roughly 80 men, reinforced by about 50 bowmen, blocking a cavalry force of about 7,000 to 8,000. The terrain choked the approach, counterattackers hit the flank, and many knights drowned in the river during the retreat. That's planning and timing, not a coin flip. What about the claim that wagons were just camp gear? Earlier armies used wagon lockers as emergency shields. The Hussites standardized them as fighting modules. Chains, mantlets, pavises, assigned crews, and posts for small guns, then drilled tactics around them. Sources describe formation sizes by lines of dozens of wagons. In some battles, reports run into the hundreds in the whole park. Some modern thinkers describe deployments of 50 to 100 wagons per line. Another recounts 500 wagons present at Aussig in 1426, alongside approximately 11,000 troops. Conclusion. What makes this story so inspiring? It's not that the peasants beat knights and walked away. It's that a society taught itself to fight in units, held a program in 4 short points, resisted outside force 5 times, and bargained from a position of strength. The weapons, wagons, crossbows, hand cannons, matter. But the change that lasted was mental. A public learned to coordinate and demand terms. Europe noticed. The use of field firearms spread. Infantry's role grew. A local dispute over bread and wine foreshadowed the religious arguments that would shake the continent a century later. The Hussite Wars began with a sermon and a broken promise, and it ended with a treaty that put a chalice on the altar for a nation. This shows that when ordinary people can explain what they're fighting for in 4 concise points, and then build simple tools that enable them to stand together, they change the odds. In Bohemia, they also changed the map of faith. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description to learn more about the Church's evolution from Christ to the Middle Ages. Check out our book, History of the Church, a captivating guide to the history of the Christian Church and events such as the Crusades, missionary journeys of Paul, conversions of Constantine, and Reformation. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.